Mia, get down! Mia! I said get your hands off her!
Ethan, no.
After recently playing Resident Evil Village, I was very pleasantly surprised at how well the game manages to dictate the two major tones of horror it tries to bring to the table. The oppressive feeling opening sequence after the house mixed with some fantastic sound design after the van crashes on the border of the village as Ethan makes his way through the forest gives the start of the game a rather grim and enigmatic tone. The feel of the game immediately changes when we acquire the knife and the first gun, and it shifts gears into an action-packed invasion of Lycans swarming onto your location. In the opening sequence to Resident Evil Village, we see two polar types of atmosphere being portrayed. The suspenseful, more paranoia-driven type of horror that makes you tense up with every snap of a branch and every crow cawing in the distance. And the guns blazing action-packed monster extravaganza that follows shortly after. It reminds me a lot of the opening of the first Resident Evil and the first zombie you encounter.
Let me take care of it!
It got me wondering why this drastic tone shift in the first bit works so well to introduce you, the player, to the way that the rest of the game feels. I found that in a lot of cases, the groundwork for the setting and tone are set up within the first few minutes of the game, laying a foundation for the intense atmosphere and bleak worlds and the loud scares that you're about to experience. It gave me an excuse to revisit and talk about some of my personal favorites in horror games and look at some of the ways that different games introduce the player to the world they're about to experience, particularly taking note of how the opening minutes of a horror game dictate the flow of the entire thing.
After killing his family, the father hung himself with a garden hose they had in the garage.
If we take PT as an example, you can see what kind of uneasiness it wants you to feel. You find yourself waking up in a room with a single door leading down a never-ending corridor, with a ghost creeping about. All the while you're trying to figure out why you're here and how you'll be able to get out of this spiral of madness. The way PT handles the creeping sense of dread and paranoia is fascinating. For a teaser, it showed a hell of a lot of the way that the developers intended to characterize the atmosphere, and in a sense making the corridor an essential character for this playable teaser. Even the way that they released a constant state of tension is really well implemented. If you get lost for too long on a single loop, eventually you will get found and, well, the game releases the tension by giving you a mild heart attack, after which, in theory, you should be able to approach the puzzles with a bit less build-up tension and a bit clearer, albeit shaken state of mind. From the very moment you wake up in that room, you're already introduced to the way the game wants to get under your skin, and it only increases these factors the further you progress. PT consistently adheres to the foundation it lays in the opening of the game and simply continues to build on this.
But he left a note that led me to this place.
Fatal Frame does something similar, but in a more deliberate and straightforward way, giving you the motivation for being there and a goal to fulfill, but rather than shrouding the haunting in mystery, it gets straight to the point. Introducing the tense atmosphere through slow, uncomfortable pans across hallways, shots that linger just a bit too long, and so on. The game introduces a slow and steady overcoming of obstacles, the obstacles being the ghosts that you need to photograph to kill them? When the game opens after a few minutes of gameplay, you're introduced to the central hub area of the game, a large two-storied room with the camera firmly stuck in the top right corner. Throughout the game's story, this room is used as a safe space of sorts with very little to no encounters, but that doesn't mean it isn't devoid of tension. Subtle things are changing constantly in the background, with spirits lurking under the stairs, behind the rice paper windows, and behind cupboards. Its primary purpose is to keep the minimal tension the player experiences a bit higher than normal, and again, like in PT, there comes a moment when that tension needs to be released. Both of these games set a wonderful example of the introduction leading the expectation for the rest of the game. However, I do find that Fatal Frame deviates from the expectations set by emphasizing the gameplay elements over the strong, foreboding, and paranoia-inducing atmosphere of the opening sequence, leading to a somewhat jarring tone shift in the middle of the game and thus removing the expectations set in the beginning, with the overcoming of obstacles taking center stage over the combination of the two, which in turn results in the intense vibes being lost and the solution-driven gameplay becoming the main focus of the game as you battle your way through ghost after ghost. Later games in the series manage to strike a bit more of a balance in this regard, and Fatal Frame 5 consistently barrages you with a lot of spirits to fend off, but the moments of silence in that game are very reminiscent of the hub area of the first game. The Shrine of Dolls is a great comparison, having you explore a shrine filled from top to bottom with dolls, giving off this eerie feeling as things start to move about in the corners of your eye. It's a much stronger balance of gameplay and atmosphere throughout the majority, though once again falling into the rabbit hole of wanting too many boss fights at the expense of the unsettling vibes. If we combine the two together, you get something like Dead Space, and I really have to refrain from gushing about how intense this game's brilliant soundscape is. Dead Space strikes an utterly brilliant middle ground between putting gameplay front and center and still having its atmosphere weigh on you like a small mountain. From the moment you crash into the Ishimura, there's this feeling of wrongness throughout the ship, which only gets confirmed when the first necromorph pops out of the ceiling. After a hectic escape into an elevator, you get to move around and explore the ship, and this is where the atmosphere starts to slowly suffocate the player. The game gives you a simple premise: cut off their limbs to kill them, and gives you various tools to do so, thus introducing the shooter elements and laying the groundwork for it. Yet in the background, we can constantly hear skittering behind the metal paneling, whispers that seem to come from nowhere, and the size of the Ishimura gets perfectly reflected by the sound of the reverberations of the large pieces of metal that settle and move.
Replacing damaged tram car. Please stand by.
A prime example would be a segment right after you get the stasis. Following up into a corridor, you can explore a bathroom. When you do, the lights suddenly go out, and just have a listen. Dead Space is an incredible showcase of setting the scene in the first few minutes of the game, and then only increasing the volume knob to intensify both the onslaught of various necromorphs, as well as keeping the Ishimura feel extremely claustrophobic and slightly suffocating.
James, honey, did something happen to you? After we got separated in that long hallway? Are you confusing me with someone else? You were always so forgetful. Remember that time in the hotel?
In Silent Hill 2, we dive a bit deeper into the psychological thematics manifesting within its fog-covered world. And from the initial cutscene of James looking into the mirror on a roadside bathroom, the game drips with a sense of melancholy that persists throughout the rest of it. From here, we get introduced to James's motivation for being in Silent Hill, and the subsequent exploration of the desolate town maintains that sense of melancholy from the first scene extremely consistently. All the characters you meet on your journey have the same sense of wrongness to them as well, giving a very detached and depersonalized feeling to every interaction with them. Building on the initial foundation, it sets out to further explore the depths of James's psyche as the world around him physically manifests as his inner demons. And through this, we get to explore what drove him to visit Silent Hill or what the town is representing. It's hard to talk about Silent Hill 2 in just a paragraph or two, but what it comes down to is that the game sticks to the groundwork it lays in the initial interaction with it. Even the sound design has a dreary vibe to it, with footsteps resounding hollow throughout the town as you run through it, to the distorted cries of pain each time you deal a blow to a monster. This detached bleakness that envelops the game has its own place as a character within the narrative it presents, letting the town tell a part of the story that James is trying to process. Whether the experience is a real one or not feels ambiguous at times, and this definitely adds to the idea of that detachment you feel with that initial look into the mirror. If we abandon the nuances and symbolism presented in Silent Hill 2 and look at the polar opposite, we get something like the cinematic Until Dawn. A choose-your-own-adventure type of horror game that pays homage to 80s slasher horror and adheres closer to the cinematic cliches of modern horror. In this opening, we get introduced to the cast of characters whose survival has been placed in the hands of the player. With a prank gone wrong, two of the characters storm off into the night, and this introduces the player to the majority of the mechanics of the game, as well as how it's going to try to scare you, mostly by having something jump at the camera followed by loud noise. At the end of the sequence, we get introduced to the concept of characters being able to permanently die throughout the story. Until Dawn plays out the same way throughout the rest of the game, and despite the story taking a slightly different turn by turning a slasher flick into a creature feature, the formula remains largely the same. Make choices, press buttons, and see if the character dies. If we look at the games mentioned before, you can see that despite their various approaches to the horror genre, most of them adhere to the principle that the opening guides the tone for the rest of the game, and the intensity dial is the only thing that really changes. And that's what really stood out to me upon first playing Resident Evil Village. Resident Evil Village adheres a lot to the initial ways it presents itself, and while the game is largely centered around the combat encounters, it does have a few moments that are reminiscent of the first sequence when you're alone and unarmed in the forest. After getting torn from your house at the very start, you crash with a van in a snowy dark forest with everyone around you dead. Trying to figure out what happened, you set out into the woods. I absolutely love the way the audio enhances the tension of the situation you're in. Much like in Dead Space, the skittering in the dark and the odd sound here and there gives the initial moments of the game such a great vibe, which comes back later in the game once you start exploring the dollhouse. While armed the rest of the game, during this section you are completely left alone in a house that constantly changes around you. This section delves a bit more into what happened to Ethan in between games and some of the deeper rooted fears he might have had, making the dollhouse feel a lot more intimate to the character than the rest of the game. You're left to your own devices to solve the puzzle of your wooden wife, all the while being chased around by a giant baby dragging its bloody umbilical cord through the hall, completely ruining the carpet. It honestly feels more like a segment that you'd find in some of the later Silent Hill titles than a Resident Evil title, but it does fit the game very well. Especially given that the way the scenery is presented is very akin to how that opening walk through the forest feels. And focusing more on the isolated and encompassing horror of what lies beyond the shadow, while the rest of the game is the initial fight against the Lycans stretched out across the rest of the game's runtime. Maybe the castle could be considered a bit of an exception, considering it's more of a hide-and-seek game, but eventually you get to use your shotguns and pipe bombs to deal with those problems. The rest of Resident Evil Village, however, plays out in adherence to the blueprint laid out in the opening few minutes. Outside of a few puzzles that you have to solve, the majority of the game puts a lot of obstacles in the way to which a solution is primarily gun. The intensity of the first encounter gets dialed down as you initially explore the village itself, but once you reach the castle, we see a lot of that intensity slowly return as you fight your way through the sisters and eventually the mistress of the castle itself. Resident Evil Village is a great example of the importance not just of setting the initial expectations, but also shows that when you stick to the foundations laid down in the opening sequence, you get a much more consistent tone throughout the rest of the game.